Picture a British or Commonwealth soldier, somewhere in the Second World War, sidearm holstered at his hip. His name, his unit, the exact action he is in, none of that survives in the material available to us. What does survive is the object itself, the standard issue revolver that most men in his position would have been carrying. 6 shots, a top-rate frame that snaps open and ejects its spent cases in one motion. Chambered for a cartridge called the 38-200, a 38 caliber case originally loaded with a soft 200-grain lead bullet. If his revolver is one of the wartime patterns, it has no hammer spur to thumb back, no single-action stage to steady the shot. Pull the trigger, and the whole mechanism, hammer, cylinder, everything, moves in one long, heavy stroke. There is no crisp break to feel for, no way to stage the shot in 2 stages, the way a target shooter might want. Just one continuous pull, from rest to bang, every single time. That was not an accident of manufacture, it was a deliberate change, introduced in the late 1930s and carried further in 1942, stripping the gun down to double action only for speed of production and, according to the historical record, to stop the hammer spur snagging on the clothing of men crewing armoured vehicles. In modern online discussion, that heavy, unforgiving trigger is often the detail cited when enthusiasts label this revolver with an unflattering nickname: Crippled. Videos get made about it. Forum threads argue over exactly how bad the pull weight really is, comparing it unfavourably to modern service pistols that were never built for the same purpose at all. Not a wartime term, not a phrase from any pamphlet the War Office ever issued. A modern judgment, arrived at from a comfortable firing point decades after the fact, by people who never had to carry the thing into anything resembling the situations it was actually designed for. And yet, this revolver, the Enfield No. 2, was adopted as Britain's standard sidearm in the early 1930s, and stayed in production for roughly 25 years into the late 1950s, carried by British and Commonwealth forces through the entire Second World War and beyond. Not a stopgap, not a wartime emergency measure rushed into service and quietly dropped the moment peace returned. A genuine, long-running standard. The dark reason it lasted that long has almost nothing to do with how well it shot. It has everything to do with what the institution that issued it actually needed a pistol to do, and what it would take, later, to admit that need had never really been about winning gunfights at all. To understand why, you have to go back to the design's beginning. British Ordnance had spent decades fielding the .455 caliber Webley revolvers, big, heavy recoiling handguns, built for an army of long-service regulars who had years, not weeks, to master them. By the late 1920s, work appears to have been underway at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield on something smaller, a .38 caliber revolver, generally credited to a Captain Boys. Formal adoption followed in the early 1930s, retiring the .455 Webley as the standard issue sidearm, though the precise date of that change is not something the surviving public record pins down with confidence. What replaced it was the Enfield No. 2 Mark I, a top-break, 6-shot revolver with a 5-inch barrel and a lanyard ring for service carry, chambered for a new cartridge, the .380 Revolver Mark I, built on a .38 Smith & Wesson case and loaded with that 200-grain soft lead bullet. This first Mark kept a hammer spur and could be fired single action for a deliberate shot, or double action for speed. On paper, it was a straightforward, sensible downsizing, intended as a smaller, lighter sidearm that was quick to open and reload, compared to the big .455 Webley it replaced. Lighter to carry all day on a belt, quicker to break open and tip out 6 spent cases at once, gentler to shoot for a man who might fire his sidearm only a handful of times a year in training. Part of that sensible case, according to historian John Moulter, as cited in a later review of Second World War handguns, was recruit training. He argues that the .455 Webley's recoil was difficult for typical recruits to control, and that a lighter cartridge made it easier to teach more men to shoot adequately, faster, a real consideration for an army that could not spend unlimited hours on secondary weapon training. A rifle or a machine gun might justify weeks of range time. A pistol, issued mainly to officers and specialists as a last resort weapon, did not. There was also a quieter, less flattering complication baked into the number 2's birth. A dispute over who actually owned the idea. Webley and Scott, Britain's most established revolver maker, had its own commercial 38-200 design on the market at the same time, visually similar enough that the resemblance mattered, similar enough that a soldier, glancing at either one from across a parade ground, might struggle to tell them apart. Webley put in a claim, reportedly on the order of £2,247, for its research and development costs. Government's position: the design belonged to Captain Boys in the Enfield factory, not to the commercial firm that had been selling something that merely looked like it. It went to the Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors, which eventually granted Webley a partial award in the region of £1,200, according to later accounts. An acknowledgement of some contribution, but nowhere near what the company had asked for. Both designs looked alike from a distance. Internally, they were different enough that their parts do not interchange to this day, a fact that would go on to confuse maintenance crews for decades. A cheaper cartridge, a recruit-friendly trigger, and a legally contested parentage. That was what the British Army adopted as its standard sidearm, before a single shot of the war it would actually fight in had been planned for. 2 changes followed, each one solving a real problem and creating a different kind of complication. The first was mechanical. On the eve of the Second World War, commonly dated to around 1938 or 1939, the Mark I star appeared, hammer spare removed entirely, the lockwork simplified so the revolver could only be fired double action. Multiple sources tie this directly to tank and armoured vehicle crews, noting that the hammer spur could catch on their uniforms and equipment in confined spaces, snagging on webbing, on the edges of a hatch, on anything a man brushed past while scrambling in or out of a cramped turret under pressure. Removing the spur removed that risk entirely, at the cost of the lighter, single-action trigger pull. In 1942, a further simplified version, the Mark I ***, arrived for the same reason manufacturing simplification always arrives in wartime: speed. Fewer parts, fewer machining steps, more revolvers out the door, at a moment when every hour saved on a production line mattered. The second change was in the ammunition, and it carried a legal shadow. That original 200-grain bullet was soft, unjacketed lead, the kind of projectile that can deform and flatten on impact, expanding well beyond its original diameter. Concerns about whether that behaviour sat comfortably with the rules the Hague Convention had laid down around expanding bullets pushed the British toward a new loading, the .380 Mark II, and later the Mark II-Z, using a lighter jacketed bullet of around 178 to 180 grains with a different propellant. The mechanics of a soldier's sidearm were being quietly rewritten, at least in part to satisfy international law, rather than purely as a response to battlefield feedback. A reminder that not every design decision in this story was driven by what worked best on a firing range. Here is where the record gets genuinely uncertain, and it is worth saying so plainly rather than papering over it. Modern shooters and reviewers, bloggers, forum posters, YouTube commentators handling these revolvers decades after they left service, consistently describe the double-action-only trigger on the Mark I * and Mark I ** as heavy, even punishing by contemporary standards. That is where the word crippled comes from. But no wartime ordnance manual or technical instruction in the accessible record gives an actual trigger pull weight for any of these marks. No number in pounds, no specification a modern reviewer could hold the gun up against and say, definitively, this is worse than it was meant to be. And the shooters themselves do not even agree with each other. Some describe the Mark I * as lighter than the original Mark I, others describe the opposite. What survives is a strong, consistent impression, and almost nothing measurable underneath it. Add to that confusion a second layer. The Enfield No. 2 was not the only .38-200 revolver in British and Commonwealth hands. Webley and Scott's own Mark IV, including examples built in Australia, used the identical cartridge and looked broadly similar from across a room, despite being, again, a mechanically distinct gun with no interchangeable parts. Meanwhile, a small Australian firm called Howard Auto Cultivators turned out a limited run of No. 2 pattern revolvers of its own during the war. on the order of 350 guns. And even those had documented problems fitting parts to one another, revolver to revolver, within that one small batch. A tiny production run, struggling with the same tolerances that larger, better-equipped factories managed more consistently. Different designs, similar names, overlapping ammunition, patchy manufacturing consistency. It is not hard to see how, from a distance of 80 years, all of that collapses into a single, flattened complaint about one gun's trigger. None of that, on its own, explains why the British Army kept issuing the thing for another 2 decades. The flattering explanation would be that the British Army examined the complaints, decided the trigger didn't matter enough to fix, and moved on with confidence. The evidence points somewhere less deliberate than that. Start with doctrine. The War Office's own small arms training pamphlets, the manuals that actually told soldiers how to use their weapons, allocate a strikingly small slice of the syllabus to the pistol at all. The 1942 pamphlet, devoted specifically to the 38-inch pistol, covers loading, unloading, basic ready positions, and short-range firing drills, including one exercise called firing by sense of direction, rather than aimed marksmanship, plus firing from behind cover. Nowhere in it is there anything resembling deliberate, sighted fire at distance, the kind of shooting where a heavy trigger pull would actually punish a man's accuracy. Compare that to the far larger volumes given over to the rifle and the machine gun in the same series, in both the 1937 and 1942 editions. Hundreds of pages devoted to marksmanship, range estimation, and fire discipline for the weapons that were actually expected to win engagements. The pistol was never being trained as a precision instrument. It was being trained as a short-range, get-you-out-of-trouble tool, issued mainly to officers, tank crews, and specialists whose main job in a fight was something other than a handgun. A man whose real weapon was a map case, a wireless set, or the vehicle he commanded, and whose revolver existed purely for the moment everything else had already gone wrong. If a weapon is only ever expected to work at arm's length, in a hurry, a heavy trigger is a much smaller problem than it looks from a shooting bench. A trigger that feels punishing over a slow, deliberate string of fire at 25 yards may barely register at all in the kind of close, frantic exchange the pamphlet was actually training men for. Then there's the industrial reality, and it mattered just as much. By the time the double-action-only marks were drawing complaints, they were also already the war effort. Contract-based production estimates put Royal Small Arms Factory Enfield's own output of the Mark I Star at roughly 144,000 units in under 3 years, from January 1939 to November 1941 alone. Albion Motors, working with its subcontractor Coventry Gauge and Tool, added a further 21,000 or so of the Mark I Star. Component suppliers, possibly including firms like Singer, were in the chain too. That small Australian firm was tooling up its own limited run at the same time. This was not a prototype under evaluation, sitting in a testing shed waiting for a verdict. This was committed, wartime manufacturing capacity, spread across multiple firms, already running at pace, with tooling set, contracts signed, and men and materials already allocated. So the honest answer is not that the Enfield No. 2 survived because it was a well-regarded fighting pistol. And it is not that the British Army specifically studied the trigger complaint and rejected it. It is that the two conditions which would have made a mid-war redesign worth pursuing, a doctrine that demanded precision shooting from a sidearm, and a production line not already running at capacity, simply did not exist at the same time. Doctrine said the pistol didn't need to be excellent. The mathematics favoured living with it over replacing it. And in the middle of the largest war in history, mathematics tends to win. The war ended. The revolver did not. That pattern did not reverse once the war was won. Standard references on the weapon, the Skeneton and Stamps monograph most often cited by specialists, placed total production between roughly 1930 and 1957, a run of very nearly 3 decades, spanning a design conceived for a peacetime army, manufactured through the largest war in history, and still coming off the line well into the following decade. Museum collections bear this out at both ends. Imperial War Museums holds examples dated to 1934 and 1937, confirming the Mark I was in full production through the middle of that decade. National collections in Britain and New Zealand hold later marks that track the pattern on through the war and beyond, into an era when jet aircraft and atomic weapons were already reshaping the rest of the military. The Revolver was still riding alongside. Nobody has produced a single, reliable factory total for how many were built. Estimates in the secondary literature range from around 270,000 to roughly 380,000 revolvers, depending on which contractor runs and which years are counted. That gap, over 100,000 revolvers of uncertainty, is itself a small piece of evidence. An institution that considered a design a serious, ongoing priority tends to keep better books than this. A sidearm nobody was fighting particularly hard to track precisely is exactly the kind of thing that slips through the cracks of official record-keeping. Replacement, when it finally came, appears to have arrived much like the original adoption did in the surviving record, gradually, and without a clean single date attached to it. The 9mm Browning high power began to supersede the Enfield No. 2 in British service sometime in the 1950s. Sources online cite 1954, 1957, and 1963 as endpoints for the revolver's service life, and those figures likely describe different things rather than contradicting each other outright. A frontline army unit retiring the gun in 1 year, colonial or police stocks still drawing on old stores well after, reserve formations carrying obsolete kit long after the regulars had moved on. No single army order in the accessible record draws a clean line under the Enfield No. 2's career. It simply thinned out of general issue over roughly a decade, the same unceremonious way it had thinned into it. No fanfare at its arrival, no fanfare at its departure. Added up, start to finish, adopted in the early 1930s to replace a revolver that later commentators argue was simply too much gun for the average recruit. Manufactured continuously for the better part of 30 years, standard issue through the entire Second World War, and only slowly, unevenly superseded across the following decade. 25 years is, if anything, a conservative way to describe how long this design remained in British hands. None of this makes the Enfield No. 2 a great pistol. It also does not make it the joke that a heavy trigger and an unkind modern nickname might suggest. It makes it something else. A case study in how large institutions actually decide what their people carry. Militaries rarely choose a weapon purely on its technical merits, and they even more rarely abandon one purely because its technical merits turn out to be modest. They choose according to what the doctrine of the moment demands, and they keep according to what the factories of the moment can deliver. The Enfield No. 2 was judged against a standard, a secondary, close-range, minimally trained sidearm for men whose real fighting tool was something else entirely. And against that standard, a heavy double-action trigger was simply not the disqualifying flaw it looks like from a modern firing range. The doctrine that shaped it was reasonable, given what pistols were actually asked to do in the British order of battle. The wartime manufacturers who kept building it were reasonable too, given what a global war demanded of factories already running at capacity. Neither the training pamphlets nor the production lines were wrong on their own terms. The revolver simply outlived the specific, narrow conditions that had made those terms sensible in the first place. And nobody with the institutional will to change course found a moment, in the middle of adopting it, fighting a war with it, or slowly retiring it, when doing so was worth the cost. That is usually how flawed designs survive inside large institutions. Not through a conspiracy to protect them, and not through anyone being fooled about their shortcomings. Through the much duller mechanism of doctrine and industry, each quietly agreeing, for their own separate reasons, that today is not the day to ask the harder question. 25 years is not a verdict on the trigger. It's a measure of how long that harder question went unasked. If you want more case files like this one, where the paper trail matters as much as the weapon, subscribe and turn on notifications so the next one doesn't slip past you.